With me is Casey Janis.
Yep.
The question I'm asking everybody is, can you trust our elections?
Nope.
Why so?
Well, look at all the fraud that took place. All right, now Livingston County, Michigan is the corrupt county that I'm from. It happens to be the second worst county in the entire country, according to even liberal lawyer friends that I do have.
Wow.
The fact is we had over 111% turnout. I don't know how that's possible in Livingston County. We had never had a turnout in past elections like that, even when Barack Obama ran. Okay, the first black president. Oh my God. I think the turnout back then was only like 47%. Now in Oakland County, which is not that far away from us, they had a 122% turnout.
Welcome back to another episode of Honor Thy Vote. I'm Paul Beran.
I'm Cynthia Walsh.
The last few episodes we had some exciting guests, very credible, but not to be outdone by today's. Tell us who we have.
So today we have Roman Bueller. He served 14 years as a senior elections counsel for the Republicans in the House of Representatives, and he was hired by Newt Gingrich as his first House Committee counsel. He is now director of the Madison Coalition at madisoncoalition.org, and he is working on the Keep 9 Amendment to ban Supreme Court packing.
There's so much to learn about today's guest and what he has to offer with election integrity. I hope you'll stay with us right after this.
What do you think of a cash reward, sir, for anyone who turns in a tip or lead for somebody who's trying to meddle with the election?
Oh, I love it. Not a cash reward. A cash reward, yeah, for turning in.
Right.
But they got to go to jail.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I love the idea. I think it's a great idea.
Thank
you.
You
Have that? Yeah,
I do.
Let me have that. You know what? I've never heard of that, and I think it's a great idea.
Help restore fair and honest elections in America. Donate as much as you can. The bigger the reward, the larger the incentive to be honest. Log on to OperationEyeball.com.
It's a great idea.
Welcome back. Today's guest, an amazing man. I'm going to let you tell us about yourself and your background. Roman Bueller.
Well, thank you so much, Paul, for having me on. It's a real honor to be on this program. As Cynthia mentioned, I spent 14 years as the senior Republican elections counsel for Republicans in the House of Representatives. And I saw a lot during that time, which I'd like to share with you all about what our future might hold if the left gets control of the elections process. I spent many years as a grassroots political activist in California, and I saw a lot of questionable activities at the retail level. But when I got to Washington, D.C., I saw the election world in a whole different light. And I think one of the takeaways that I'd like to share with you is the left's goal is absolute power. And to get absolute power, they need to control the elections process. And so they have been working systematically for decades to federalize the elections process so that the rules for voting and campaigning are all controlled in Washington. Now, what would that mean, right? The Democrats have a bill right now, which they have pledged to pass as soon as they get a majority. It's called the John Lewis Voting Rights Bill, named after one of the great civil rights heroes of our time. But they should be ashamed of what's in that bill, because the essence of that bill is federal control of elections. And what does that mean? It means that if the bill is 100 pages of election rules, the actual rules will be 10,000 pages of federal regulations that micromanage how elections are handled at the state and maybe even at the local level. And how are those regulations going to be approved? They're not going to be approved by Congress. They're going to be dictated by bureaucrats in Washington. And who's going to appoint those bureaucrats? President of the United States. Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that if you put one person in charge of the rules all over the country, that will determine whether or not he is or she is reelected, you've greatly weakened our democratic process. Because, some presidents might use that power wisely, but we've had presidents in our time who did not use their power wisely. And putting all of that power in the hands of one person to a point of bureaucracy that can enforce and interpret election rules all over the country is extremely dangerous. And that is what the left is planning.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Absolutely.
And that's what this is about, is keeping the corruption out of our government.
That's correct.
And keeping elections meaningful. Now, you had talked about the importance of voter ID.
Mhm.
Tell us about your perspective.
So, for many, many years, Republicans have, not just in Washington, but all over the country, tried to promote a requirement, a very simple requirement, that in order to vote, you have to do the same thing that you would do to get a driver's license or to get a hunting or fishing license. You have to prove who you are, to show a government-issued photo ID, something that can't be created on somebody's home computer, in order to vote. And what do the Democrats say? They say requiring an ID to vote is voter suppression. That somehow, if you require people to show an ID, that's going to suppress the vote. I have a story to tell you about my time in the House of Representatives that I think illustrates the absurdity of what Democrats are talking about. In 2006, when I was working at the Committee on House Administration, then the Republican on the committee, Kevin McCarthy, proposed a very, very simple amendment to the Democratic election. All it said was that voters, in order to vote in a federal election, had to show a government-issued photo ID. But if you didn't have an ID, all you had to do was sign an affidavit saying, I don't have an ID, and you could vote. So there was no way that this bill would disenfranchise anyone who had the ability to sign their name. And what happened? Every Republican on the committee voted for it. Every Democrat on the committee voted against it. So
what would be the reason to vote against it?
the reason to vote against it is because Democrats want to cheat at the state level. They want people to vote who aren't who they say they are. And so, they claim that they don't want a voter ID because, some people don't have a voter ID and we disenfranchise them. But here was a bill that wouldn't have disenfranchised anyone who could sign their name, and Democrats opposed it because they want to make sure that in close elections, their political machines at the local level can pack the voting rolls and pack the voter booths with people who aren't really say they are. And it exposes their intentions, I think, in a way that we need to tell people about.
And on the flip side of that, if you make it easy for anyone to vote, you also need to have the borders open so many people can come in that essentially aren't entitled to vote, but could vote if they just sign that paper.
So there's a battle right now in American politics. Is the left that, in my view, wants to make it easy for illegal aliens who are not eligible to vote to register and cast their ballots. And the great majority of Americans who think that that's insane, who think that voting is a privilege that should be reserved for citizens. So
isn't that the federal law? I mean, isn't that right now the way that the law states that you have to be a citizen to vote in a federal election?
that's absolutely right. Right. The law, federal and state laws require citizenship to vote.
Citizens vote, non-citizens don't.
So, right.
But here's how the left is subverting that process. And I have a story to tell you about the results. But first, let's take a look. We know that under Democratic presidents, the protections, the security of the border has been undermined. That millions of people who are not citizens have been allowed in. Some just cross the border. Some get various forms of temporary status, but they're all non-citizens. So then we also know that in states where Democrats control the process, these non-citizens are given the opportunity to get driver's licenses. And we also know that in states where Democrats control the process, the driver's license authorities are forbidden from asking these citizens if these individuals, these who may or may not be citizens, forbidden to ask people if they're citizens. And we also know that in a lot of these states, you are registered to vote automatically unless you affirmatively state you do not wish to register. So you're sitting there and you're getting your driver's license. You're not in this country. You're not a citizen. And somebody says, do you want to register to vote? Well, the incentive is to not say anything, right? If you're going to be given a registration form and you don't get the form, you get the form automatically. Excuse me. You get the form automatically unless you say no. You don't want to say no because that isn't, why don't you want to register to vote? Could that mean you're not a citizen? So the incentive is to stay quiet. And if you stay quiet, you automatically get a registration form. So here's the Democrats. They're letting people in. They're giving them driver's licenses. They're registering them to vote unless they affirmatively say no. They're not asking them if they're citizens. And then what happens? You're on the voting rolls. Well, then in states where Democrats control, every voter, whether they ask for one or not, gets an absentee ballot. Every voter gets one. So you didn't ask for it, it shows up. And then in states where Democrats control the process, they have a process most of you probably know about it called ballot harvesting, where people go and they get paid the day after these absentee ballots show up. On anybody who's on the roll, somebody gets paid to go and collect that ballot. And the combination of all of those processes, it's almost inevitable that people who are not citizens are going to have their ballots sent, their absentee ballots sent to them, and their ballots harvested by these harvesters. Now, how do you prove that? Right? We don't have a list of citizens in this country. You go to somebody, very hard to look at a list of voters and say, oh, these are the non-citizens. Oh, so the Democrats say, well, we can't prove this. Well, of course not, because they've set up a system where the evidence that we would need isn't there.
Right.
So I want to tell you a story about one of the investigations that I led when I was the senior counsel in the House. There was a very close election in California. A gentleman named Dornan ran against a woman named Sanchez. She was the challenger. And there were some allegations of fraud in that election. And so the House of Representatives did an official investigation. And we went in, and after a lot of work, we got the INS and the federal authorities to provide us a list of people who lived in Orange County who were not citizens. Now, these were not illegals. They were in the country legally, but they were applying for citizenship or they were not yet citizens. So the INS had their names. And we found that list with names, addresses, birth dates, and we cross-referenced it, not just with the people who were registered to vote, but with the people who were registered to vote and cast ballots.
Cast the ballot, yeah.
And we found 650 matches of people whose name, address, and birth date of a verified non-citizen was identical to the name, address, and birth date of someone who had cast a vote. And the only reason we didn't overturn that election is the margin was 1,100 votes. But we had overwhelming evidence, some would say proof, that 650 non-citizens had voted in that election. And those were just the ones we could prove, right? We never could get a list. There wasn't a list. There isn't a list of people who are in the country illegally who are undocumented. And so if there were 650 legal aliens who cast illegal votes, how many were illegal? No one can say. And that is the challenge to our system. And we've got to figure out a way to stop it.
As I understand, when you go to vote, if you don't have proper identification, that proof of citizenship, and you're asked, for it, that you can sign an affidavit that says, well, yeah, I'm allowed to vote, and they'll still let you vote under those circumstances. That gives essentially the voter rolls permission to check you out.
So in most states, you're not even asked. In most states, you show up, and if it's a state requires an ID, you present your ID. If it's not a state where you present your ID, in some states you just state your name and state the address. And So the Republicans in Congress have proposed a law which would require that people verify their citizenship before they vote, but the Democrats oppose that law. But I want to tell you another story which I think illustrates the extent to which Democrats will go to prevent any kind of a requirement that people verify their citizenship. I was part of the Republican team that negotiated a bill called the Help America Vote Act in 2003, which was designed as a way to solve some of the voting problems created by the hanging chads of the punch card voting system that was then in place in Florida. And so in Florida, as you may recall, there was a very close election in 2000 for president. And the system that Florida had at the time, where you would vote on a machine and the machine would punch out a little chad in a voting card, and then the card would be fed through a reader. And some of the chads weren't punched out exactly by the machine, and so you had a situation where people were looking at these voting things and trying to figure out if a chad, which was punched partway out, had come loose or it was a vote. And then there were all sorts of problems. There were some ballots where there was a hole through the ballot, and so are those ballots going to be counted or not? And so as a result of these problems, Congress decided to pass a law which would fix these punch card voting machines. But the Democrats decided to use that law as a way of imposing the beginnings of national control over federal elections. And one of the issues that came up was that, as you might know, there is a federal voting form where you can register to vote on this federal form, mail it in or hand it in, and you're registered to vote. And on that form, there is a question that says, are you a United States citizen? Yes or no? And so Republicans proposed, a very simple requirement that if you don't check the yes box that you're a citizen, the form not be processed and it be sent back to the voter to ask, are you a citizen or not? Because you don't want to check a form where the voter hasn't stated they're a citizen. And the Democrats absolutely would not support that change. And their excuse was that at the bottom of the form there was all this fine print. If you signed it, it included a statement that I'm a citizen. But how many of us read all the fine print, right? And so how difficult is it to require that somebody check the yes box? That's why the box is there on the form, because people know that
draw attention to it.
Right. And the Democrats would not do that. And to me, that signals that the Democrats do not want a system which prevents non-citizens from getting on the rolls and being allowed to cast a vote.
What happens if they don't check?
They don't check it. Right now, federal law allows the election authorities to process the form as a valid form.
Regardless.
So all these forms that have been processed where they didn't check yes, we have no way of knowing how many there are, but that's the rule. And we ought to insist that rule be reinstated.
How many states are actually cleaning up the rolls? Do you know?
That is a very complicated question. And there is a good friend of mine, you might want to interview him, his name is Christian Adams, and he runs an organization whose work is suing states that don't clean up their voter rolls. The bill we passed and earlier bills have a requirement that states do reasonable cleanup, and then of course the question is what's
reasonable. Yeah.
So that we have an enormous amount of work to do, and if you're working in your state, you might want to contact Christian or some of the other groups.
And let us know here too at HonorThyVote as well.
Yes.
Now, I understand just yesterday across my desk that North Carolina took almost 500,000 votes off of their rolls that they deemed to be ineligible to vote. And that's just very recent.
So this is states. States have an obligation to clean their rolls. Right. Some are doing it, some are not. And we ought to insist that they do.
Tell us about Madison.
So Madison Coalition, we put it together about 10 years ago with the help of Reagan's former Attorney General, Ed Meese. And the goal of the Madison Coalition is to strengthen checks and balances against the abuse of federal power. And, you know, we talk a lot about electing politicians, and most of our energy is in that elections process. I don't think we talk enough about making politicians do things that will preserve our constitutional republic. And, you know, we look at history, and every democracy in past centuries that has formed has devolved. Historically, the risk is that they devolve into tyranny, and the risk is that our nation is headed in the same direction.
That's right.
And so we think that the greatest threat to the integrity of the American elections process is at the end of the process. A contested election, as it did in 2000, ends up in court. And
The Supreme Court.
unfortunately, the Supreme Court.
Right.
And issues of who is allowed to vote and what the rules are also frequently end up at the Supreme Court. And right now, we have a court whose tendency is to enforce the Constitution and interpret the Constitution as written. The left doesn't want that. They want a flexible Constitution that means what they want it to mean. And, you know, the court is one of the most powerful institutions in America, but it is also the most fragile. And with a single law, with 50 votes plus a vice presidential tiebreaker, 218 votes in the House, 50 Senate votes, 218 in the House, and a presidential signature, the left could pass a law that increases the number of justices. Some of you may have heard it. It's called court packing. And every single Democrat, but two in the United States Senate, is now committed to the first step in this process, which is getting rid of the filibuster for voting issues. And once they've done that, it's pretty clear that they're going to add at least one, maybe two new states. And if they increase their Senate majority, they would then have the ability to pass a law increasing the number of justices. And what would that mean? It would mean that the court no longer is an independent entity. The court would be under control of the majority party.
Mm-hmm.
And the danger is that if one side or one party packs the court with their own people, the next party that gets in charge will have the temptation to do exactly the same thing. And we end up with a party that's a rubber stamp for Republicans or Democrats, who's ever in power. And a court that is a rubber stamp for the party in power cannot be a party that checks the authoritarian impulses of someone in power. So our nation is at risk, our republic is at risk, and the integrity of our elections are at risk because of this plan by the left to pack the Supreme Court.
And that's what they mean when they say we're going to lose our country.
That's right. That's right. And because you can't have a country unless people who disagree on many things feel like at the end of the day, they're going to get their fair shot to change things.
Mm-hmm.
If you discovered that someone had bought the referees in your favorite football league, and your team was always going to lose, would you continue watching the game?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the danger. If the left ends up packing the Supreme Court, and people decide that they're going to win all the time, or frankly, if the right did it, it'd be the same problem.
That's right.
And so the question is, how do we prevent this from happening? And if you listen to politicians, they will tell you, well, just elect me in the next election, I'll solve the problem. But we cannot solve the problem because we cannot win every election. If you look back over the last 100 years, there's never been a period of longer than 15 years between times when the left has won a trifecta majority, control of the Congress and the White House. So they're going to win again, either because there's a recession or because the conservatives split in a particular election, as they did in 1912 or 1964. There's going to be another left majority. And unless we take away the power of politicians to manipulate the size of the Supreme Court before the left wins their next majority,
right.
we're going to end up with a packed court, and we're going to lose the essence of what keeps our country a republic and what keeps it together.
Mhm.
So there's an effort now, which we lead, the Madison Coalition, to enact something called the Keep 9 Amendment.
Mhm.
It would be the shortest amendment in American history, only 13 words. It just says, the Supreme Court of the United States shall be composed of 9 justices. Now, it's very hard to get into the Constitution. It takes a vote of 2/3 of the House, 2/3 of the Senate, and then ratification
Ratified, right.
by 3/4 of the states.
Mhm.
But if you look at the history of constitutional amendments in America, we had women's right to vote, prohibition, the repeal of prohibition, presidential term limits, and the 18-year-old vote, all of which were very, very simple ideas that the public overwhelmingly supported. When they became widely known, and politicians who wouldn't support these things began to lose elections. What started as very divisive issues became consensus issues, and these amendments were adopted. So our strategy is to take this very simple amendment, which is now, first was introduced by a Democrat in Congress, now has since been backed by 200 members of Congress and more than 800 state legislators around the country, and polling shows that voters by more than 2-to-1 margin would support it. If we can make this amendment widely known, if Keep 9 becomes as much of a household word as the Patriot Act or Obamacare,
Mhm.
we think public pressure could force Congress, even a divided Congress, to propose the amendment and end the threat of court packing before one side or another gets a majority and tries to pack the court.
So there are a lot of House and Senate seats up for grabs in this election. Our viewers really should attend any events that those candidates are speaking and ask them, do you support Keep 9? And put them on the spot, make them answer.
Absolutely. Because there are all sorts of candidates around the country. Imagine what party they're in. Who say, well, I'm not for court packing. Oh, no, I'd never do that. Well, the question is, if you're not for court packing, then will you support
That's right.
this simple amendment that says the Supreme Court shall be composed of 9 justices? Will you support it or not? And if somebody says, I'm against court packing, but I don't want to support an amendment to make sure it never happens,
Because they're not really.
then you might sound like somebody outside, lurking around outside your house, who says, well, I'm not a burglar, but I don't want to outlaw burglary, right? And so if we can get voters to start laughing at people who say they're not for court packing, but they don't want to ban it, that might be the thing that decides some close elections
Mhm.
and decides who wins the election. And I'll tell
That's
you,
right.
there's no more important issue at stake this fall in elections for the White House and the Senate and the House than whether or not America preserves the independent Supreme Court
That's right.
that protects the integrity of our elections and, frankly, protects the integrity of our constitutional republic.
Is there a way that anyone who's interested in learning more about Keep 9 can go to a website?
Sure. So, first of all, you can go to the Keep 9 website, www.keep9.org.
That's the number 9.
Either one.
Oh, okay.
Keep9.org. And if you want, you can email us you can email the Keep 9 movement at leaders@keep9.org. Leaders@keep9.org. So go to the website, email us, because we are building a national network of people who will raise this issue in districts all over the country. This battle will go on after the election. We want to make sure that before the left wins their next majority, we put this amendment into the Constitution.
Are there any parting words that you can offer folks who are really interested in election integrity, other things that they can do to help make sure that we have fair and honest elections this year?
So I would say our biggest challenge as advocates of election integrity is to convince people that election integrity is the keystone for our republic. And so asking people, where do you stand on requiring that somebody show a government issued photo ID to vote. And when they say yes, as almost any reasonable person would do, say, why is it that some people don't want that requirement? And same question, ask, shouldn't there be a requirement that before people register to vote, they check, yes, I'm a citizen on the voter registration box? And then ask, why is it that some people don't want that requirement?
That's right.
We've got to convince people that the battle we're fighting is not just a partisan battle. It's a battle to save the country. Because if we don't have honest elections, we don't have a country.
As long as those requirements aren't there, as I see it, the only thing we can do right now, today, is to infiltrate those people who would think that they could vote, to convince them not to, if they are not a citizen, because that's the way the law states. We have a mantra that we repeat every time, so we're going to do it again. Citizens vote, non-citizens don't. Okay, we encourage them. Print it on a T-shirt, put it on a sign, put it on a community bulletin board. Make sure that you get that information out there, because there's a lot of folks who think they can, and they need to know that they can't.
They're absolutely right. We need to let people know what the law is, and if people don't know what the law is, then they have an excuse.
That's
So
right.
our job is to educate and inform, and if we do that job, we can save the republic.
Counselor, I so appreciate you being here and all the work that you've done and continue to do for this country.
Well, Paul and Cynthia, thank you
you.
so much for giving me
Thanks.
the opportunity.
I want to do those websites one more time. Keep9.org.
Keep9.org and leaders@keep9.org. Email us at leaders@keep9.org.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This year's presidential election is most critical for the survival of our nation. Only with extreme scrutiny by American people can we be assured our elections are true and honest. Be very watchful at all levels of government. Let those individuals responsible for counting and reporting votes know in no uncertain terms that any suspicious activity will be immediately reported to the authorities and posted online. Please visit Operation Eyeball to see all the many ways elections have been altered by malicious actors right before our eyes. We cannot rely on conventional law enforcement channels to catch all these criminals and bring them to justice. We are all called to action. We need to be vigilant and watchful. Go to OperationEyeball.com. Keep in mind, it is illegal for non-citizens to vote anywhere in the United States in a federal election. Come to Operation Eyeball, offer your tips and suggestions. There is a reward for any tips that lead to the arrest and conviction of anyone attempting to alter the election illegally. Go to OperationEyeball.com.
Well, our guest was fantastic, wouldn't you say?
That was fantastic.
Yeah, we all have to stay in the fight and keep it going. And join the fight too if you haven't. Go to OperationEyeball.com. That's going to give you the latest information of those who have been arrested and convicted around the country of election or voter fraud. And also you might see a whole list. This is another thing we have an exclusive on OperationEyeball.com. There's a whole list of election integrity groups around the country. If you hadn't checked it out, we're omnipotent, right? Every state, almost every city, there are groups. There are national groups. There's somebody out there that you can join if you don't already belong, so you can do your part. Absolutely, to guarantee that we have election integrity starting today and moving forward. Thanks so much for joining us this time. Keep on the good fight. Don't forget, ready? Citizens vote, non-citizens don't. And then last but not least, if you are voting for Trump, we invite you to lay on your horn as you're leaving the voting polls. It's what we call trumpet for Trump, so that everybody gets the courage to do the same thing. If they're standing in line and they hear cars honking their horn, they know that you trumpeted for Trump, and they will do the same. Right? See you next time on HonorThyVote.com.